Exam 1, covering part 1, quizzes part 2, covering part 2. Deadline October 19th at end of day. Exam 2, covering part 2, quizzes part 3, covering part 3. Deadline November 16th. Exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th. And then exam 5, the final, without deadlines, December 14th at noon. All the stuff's been available since day 0. Just be sure to complete things before the deadlines. For the paper, draft deadline November 9th, +5 bonus deadline November 14th, emergency deadline November 21st, and the 50% desperation deadline December 8th. Before going to the old new stuff, anything about any previous stuff, or stuff to be that needs more stuff. Okay, so last time we're looking at our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas, laying out the classic 5 ways. And the final one we looked at was the 4th way, the way of gradation, which is essentially taken from our good dead friends Plato and Aristotle. And the idea here is that when you're talking about, more or less, predicating them of things, typically we think of saying, say, somebody is taller than someone else. We usually think of comparing the two things together. And the way Aquinas says this works is we're actually comparing them both to the greatest of that type. So, in this case, the tallest. Or if we're talking about beauty, the most beautiful. Now, much like our good dead friend Plato and Aristotle, he believes that, therefore, there has to be something that is of the highest type. Something that is truest, something that is best, something that is noblest. And if every category, quality thing has the maximum of that thing, then there must be something most in the that exists, super real. Now, at this point, still very similar to our good dead friends Plato and Aristotle, and both Plato and Aristotle would agree that if you are saying in virtue of what is something of a category, like in virtue of what are humans, or beautiful things, beautiful, or backpacks, backpack, the answer for Plato's we'll see in the future, but also see now, is that there's the form, this perfect entity that makes all, it's the form of backpack, it makes all backpacks backpack, and it is the perfect form of backpack. And Aristotle would agree in a similar way, except he wouldn't have Platonic form, he would have a form small enough. Now, at this point, this is where Aristotle, Plato, and Aquinas would part company. Because Plato would say, yeah, there is a perfect thing for every quality, the form of beauty, the form of justice, but they're all separate. So there's a whole bunch of singular perfect things. Each individual quality gets its own form. Now, what Aquinas does is he groups them together. He says, so there must be one thing which is the cause of everything's being, goodness, perfection, etc., wrapped up into one complete package, one entity. So instead of Plato's view, we get all these separate things. You have one singular being that is the best, the most perfect in all these respects, the most perfect being. And he's careful to, instead of just simply saying this is God, he's always careful to say this is, all people call God, or everyone calls it God, so he concludes that this would be God. Now again, with all his ways, they're taken from other sources, and so he's well aware that he's making a jump from where Plato and Aristotle and others went to something new. Namely, instead of having all the forms, everything's smushed together into one thing, and this is God. And kind of the challenge here is, if you buy all this stuff, there's a question of, but why think that there is one thing that has it all, just one single being? But that's what he claims. Well, if we're going to our final way, way 5, anything about way 4, it needs more way. Way 5, governance of the world. Now this is what becomes known as the argument from design. As we saw in the ancient days before time, there are essentially, so far, we've seen two main ways to argue for God. One, put forth by our good dead friends at Ansel, the ontological argument, an a priori argument for God. You know, roughly put, God is perfect, so he's got to exist, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be perfect, but he is. That's what he does. Then there are the cosmological arguments, which are that you can't get something from nothing, there should be something that's always been that caused or created everything else, that is a necessary being that creates everything else, and this must be God. And those are cosmological arguments. And the third, and final from the standpoint of many people, is the argument from design. Now, Aquinas' particular version is stolen from Aristotle. In fact, they all kind of get stolen from Aristotle, and also Plato too. So here's how it goes. One of the challenges faced by people who are trying to explain the world is explaining that there seems to be an order to things. For example, if you apply water to, normal water to fire, what happens to fire? Yeah, it goes up. It doesn't like explode, except in Cleveland, where the water, well, it doesn't burn anymore. The lake has, the river has been flame-free since a while. They wrote a little sign, our rivers don't want to burn. Yeah, and so things tend to work in consistent ways. So if you're thirsty, eating a handful of dust, not going to help you. Drink water would help you. And so there seems to be a definite order to things. Things act in very consistent ways. Objects fall down, water puts out fires, fire heats things up, ice cools things down, and everything works very consistently. And back, in the ancient days, people were trying to explain, how does this work? How does all this stuff function? Now, one reasonable way to explain this is by analogy with people. Like we look at people, and mostly they do things, for a reason. So when, if there's a schedule a person follows, we think they always follow that schedule because they're intelligent. They're guiding themselves. They get up in the morning, have their breakfast, go to work, etc. And it makes sense to say, well, just as a person orders things, orders their life and does things, maybe there's something guiding everything. Now, one way to do this is to say that everything's got like little minds in it. That apples have like a little mind, so that's why they fall. That water has minds in it, so that's why it does what it does, just like a person does what they do. But what Aristotle and later Aquinas do is this. They claim, first step, things that don't think, because neither Aristotle nor Aquinas want to put little minds into like apples or water or fire or other things that don't have, don't seem to have minds. But he notes that they seem to act for animals. Why? Well, because they act very consistently. And a good question is, why does that happen? One concrete example would be, if you plant an acorn and you take care of it, what do you expect to come out of the ground? Well, acorns are grown to what? Oak trees.
Oh, I know that.
No, learn something new. What did you learn in your philosophy class? Acorns grow into oak trees. And occasionally, squirrels burrow to eat, but occasionally they grow into more trees. And so we would be very surprised if we planted an acorn and like a flamingo popped out of the ground. That would be weird. But before people knew about genetics, their question would be is, why do acorns become oak trees? How does that work? Now, the claim is, if something doesn't have knowledge itself, it's got to be directed by something. It's got to have something guiding. I mean, to use an analogy that, think of like, one that the Aquinas were aware of, if you had like a car, and you just let it go down the hill, it's just going to go all over the place and crash. But if you have someone steering it, then they can guide it. And so his reasoning is, things that don't have knowledge, like water and apples and fire, they have to be guided. Otherwise, it'd just be chaos. It'd just go all over the place. Now, Aristotle believed that things were guided, but they were guided not by God, because he didn't believe in God. But what Aquinas does is goes from, things act consistently, they don't have things that don't have knowledge must be guided, so there must be a being, a single being that directs everything, that organizes the entire world. And this has to, of course, has to be God. And this becomes generically what's known as the argument from design. You look at the world, things seem well organized, seem well designed. There can be no design without a designer. The only being up to this task would be God. Now Darwin, Charles Darwin, the evolution guy, was sympathetic in some ways to this argument. He noted that one of the challenges he faced was explaining how the eye worked, because it seemed just so well designed. Because if it was, if the eye wasn't the way it was, it would seem that it wouldn't work at all. So how could you have evolution? Now, scientists today have to their satisfaction come up with an analysis of how that could occur, but it is that challenge. If you can't explain it by natural selection and evolution, and the only way it could occur is by design, then the question arises, what designs it all? And people generally point towards God. So that's way 4. Before going to the final way 5, anything about design that needs more stuff? Now, Aquinas' various views, of course, have been subject to criticism. And some of them are good and some are not so good. And some of them are just kind of mistaken. First common mistake is this. Now, when people argue about God, even to this day, one sort of favorite challenge of people who are atheists or at least skeptics is, who created God? If the idea is everything's going to be created, then the problem is, well, if everything has to be created, you say God created everything, then who created God? And then typically, atheists, smug atheists will say, aha, I disproven God. Now, Aquinas has a principled way to avoid this, namely this. Now, his argument, even though it may kind of seem like it, does not actually require that everything be have a cause. Because if everything had to have a cause, including God, and this is why the smug atheist argument doesn't work, you would need a cause of the cause. And it wouldn't be the first cause, you'd need like another cause, which means you'd have nothing. So true, the argument that if God needs a cause, what caused God, that's basically saying everything needs a cause, so God can't exist because he needs to be caused by something. Well, that would kind of work, but it would disprove everything. So there'd be nothing. So how does Aquinas get around this? Well, he doesn't assume that everything must have a cause. It's something similar. It's a very subtle difference, but it's a subtle difference that makes quite a difference, which is this. His claim is not everything needs a cause, but everything that is potentially something, say potentially moving, must be caused by something that is actual. So it's not that everything that is must be caused by something else, it's if something is potentially, say, moving, but isn't moving, or potentially exists, but somehow doesn't, it must be caused by something that is actual. So created beings are beings that just are potential rather than pure actuality. They have to be caused. Now God, as we saw, at least for Aquinas, is pure actuality. So God doesn't need a cause. So to raise the question, well, who caused God? Aquinas would say, well, nothing. God doesn't need a cause because God is pure actuality. There's no explanation needed. Now, of course, some people may question that and say, well, surely God must have a cause. But again, the problem there is if a person brings it in to say, well, that God must have a cause too, but you can use that argument on anything. And if you get into that infinite regress, then we'd have nothing at all, which is how Aquinas argues. It's got to be something, it's got to be God.
So when you say pure actuality, do you mean something that has an actual cause?
Oh, in the case of God, he wouldn't have a cause at all because he's pure actuality. You know, crudely and kind of wrongly put, there was never a time we just had potential where something had to be done to him to make him God. He wasn't like junior God and then to like work his way up to full God. The idea is that God doesn't need a cause because he's pure actuality. It's only lesser beings that have potential that need something to, you know, boost them from potential to actual. Now, a person, of course, could dispute this and say that's just, you know, that's a trick, just to say he's actual, he doesn't need to be caused. But Aquinas can run that infinite regress and say, well, if we say that everything has to have a cause, then we'd have nothing. There'd be nothing here, because you'd go off from that regress. So you have to have some first thing, and he says it's gotta be God. Does that help? Now another point that comes up is the question of the world having or not having a beginning in time. And going back to the ancient Greeks, it's, you know, an ancient question. Namely, does the world have a beginning or not? Aristotle believed the world was eternal. It has always been, always shall be, without beginning, without end. Now, Aquinas himself doesn't attempt to prove or disprove it. And he does consider that you could have potentially an eternal universe. But then the challenge is, how do you reconcile an uncreated universe, an eternal universe, with God? Yeah, because the Bible talks about, you know, God creating everything. So how could you have like a universe that's always been, yet still have God as creator? Well, he actually has a way to work around that. Namely this way. You can have God be the first cause. Now normally we think of causation in order, in like a temporal sequence. One thing happens, something follows it. Like if you had to learn about World War I, history, you have the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and then that leads to, through the entangling alliances, to World War I. Now, you can, however, have causes where there is the cause is not prior to the effect in time, which will seem kind of weird, but in a way, hopefully it'll make some sense. And the standard example is this. Imagine, if you will, an eternal flame burning forever on eternal oil. So we can imagine like a magical bowl of oil with a magical fire. The oil never runs out, so the fire has always been burning the oil has always been, and never runs out. In this case, the oil didn't come before the fire didn't come before the oil. They are both eternal. But of course, the oil is the cause of the fire, because if you have no oil, you would have no fire, even though they both could be eternal. There never was a time without the oil or the fire. Now God could be a cause in the same way, namely that the world has always been, but God is like, analogous to the oil. You think of the world as the fire, God is the oil, that God keeps the world in existence. So if there was no God, there would be no world. But there wasn't a time where there was just God and nothing. The world has always been, God has always been. But he's the cause, because without God, you would have no world. Just like with the flame. The oil is the cause of the flame, no oil, no flame. Likewise, no God, no world. Now, Aquinas does consider that. Some thinkers have thought, the world got a beginning in time. Some said, it doesn't. So what does he end up with? Well, philosophically, he says it could go either way. He doesn't have like a hard commitment to either position philosophically. But he goes with, of course, the story of Genesis, which says what? Yeah, God created the world, you get a timeline for it, And so he says, well, if you take the book of Genesis and you don't look at it, say, metaphorically, you use cause and stuff, and you use the time in the normal sense, then yeah, you'd say, you know, beginning there was nothing, then God did some stuff. So you had the time before the world, where there was God, and then God created it, and now he keeps it going. But Aquinas says, you know, this is a matter of revelation, not a matter of philosophical, you know, investigation. And so he's fine either way. So you don't need to have a beginning and time for the world. But Aquinas says, yeah, probably because that seems like a reasonable interpretation of Genesis. Now there are some common criticisms of his argument. First one is this. One thing is, of course, you get the 5 separate arguments. So one potential criticism is to say, well, you've got 5, you could say, well, I accept his 5 arguments, but instead of one God, you end up with 5 beings. You end up with a unmoved mover, you end up with a first efficient cause, you end up with a necessary being, you end up with the being that's got all the perfections, you end up with the being that guides everything, and so you end up with 5, gods instead of just one. Now, so how could we end up with just one God? Well, this is something that comes up with later thinkers as well, and if you ever take modern philosophy or philosophy of religion, you'll see that it can lead to some pretty crazy places. But here's a way you can argue for there only being one God. And here's how it can go. Now, in the way of gradation, way 4, God is supposed to be the ultimate of everything, perfect in all these regards. Now, suppose you had, or tried to have, 2 beings that were completely perfect. Now, a couple of potential problems here. One is, of course, a matter of what's called identity, from a philosophical standpoint. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about personal identity. Now, if you have 2 things, supposedly 2 things, that are absolutely identical, no differences whatsoever, can they really be 2 things? I mean, perfectly identical, no differences at all. No, because they, like location, for example, they have to be in the same place. So you might suspect, if 2 things were completely identical, not just like super alike, but utterly identical, they'd have to be the same things. I mean, to use an example from comic books, think of like Clark Kent and Superman. They're identical, but of course they're also the same person, just under different names. Now another problem is this one. Now imagine a perfect being. Now try to imagine like another perfect being. Now one way to look at this, to use a metaphor, is think instead of like having all the money in the world instead of being perfect. Now, being perfect means you got everything. You're missing nothing. All the good stuff, you got it all to maximum or beyond. And of course, to have all the money in the world means you got what? Yeah, you get all the money. If it's money, you've got it. So how many people could there be in the world that have all the money in the world? Yeah, there's one. Because if you have 2 people and they both claim to have all the money, one of them's going to be wrong. Because whatever money this other person has, that takes away from what the other person could potentially have. So even if there was one person left with 1 penny, this person would not have all the money in the world because they're missing that 1 penny. Now, people have argued is that God, being perfect, he's got to have everything. Because if he didn't have everything, he'd be missing something. He'd be less than perfect. Even if it was the metaphorical equivalent of 1 penny, it'd be like this little tiny, missing speck. But it'd be enough to make him less than perfect, because he'd be missing that speck. So God's got to have everything. So you couldn't have two beings, because if you had two beings, whatever this one would take away from God. Just like you can't have two richest people, you can have two rich people in the world, but you can't have two people with all the money, because if this person's got whatever money this person's got, this person doesn't have. And so there has to be only one perfect being. And so Aquinas could say, yeah, if you have a being that's perfect, there can only be one of them, because otherwise it wouldn't be perfect, so there's just one God. Now, this ends up leading to something crazy called pantheism. Most famously put forth by this dead guy, Spinoza, who actually accepted it. But most thinkers think it's, if you end up there, it's like super crazy town. Pantheism is the view that there is only God, one God, and that's everything. Everything is God, in a literal sense. Not like that we're like part of God or God's children, but this is everything, and this is also God. Everything is part of God. Just like, to use a metaphor, all the cells that make up your body are part of you. Likewise, everything that's of the world would make up God. So you're part of God, I'm part of God, everything's part of God. And again, most thinkers think that's crazy, because the normal view is you got God, you got the world, and they're not the same. But Spinoza makes that argument, that if there's anything that's not God, then God's not perfect, because he's missing stuff. So God's got to have, he's got to have everything. And then critics say that's crazy talk. And Spinoza says, crazy but true. Last thing, Aquinas again is careful not to just lead to, argument God. He always says something like, this everyone understands to be God, or this all people call God. Now, he can note that even though like the first mover, the first efficient cause, the designer, those all seem different from the standard God of Christianity, what he can say and did say is, well, the 5 ways are not meant to give you like everything about God, but they all together point towards God. Also, he could argue the way of gradation does give you like the perfect God, because God is supposed to be all all good, all knowing, all powerful, all the good qualities. He's perfection in those. But again, it leads to a problem that Aquinas either wasn't aware of or chose not to be aware of. Again, that problem of pantheism. If God is perfect, then means he can't be missing anything. So you end up with that pantheism thing, which is, again, kind of crazy. Okay, so that ends the 5 ways. Aquinas dies, becomes a saint, still at today, still a saint. Before pressing on, anything about Thomas Aquinas? It needs any more stuff? Okay, now we turn to another pro-God thinker, our good dead friend, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, Leibniz was Leibnizing in what is now known as Germany. If you took world history and European history, what we now call Germany was made up of Germanic states, and they weren't unified until relatively recently, historically speaking. And then, of course, they lost World War I, and then started World War II, and then lost World War II, and were split up, and now they're back together again to one Germany. And nothing can go wrong from that. Now, during the time period when Leibniz was Leibnizing, German culture, again, there wasn't a country then called Germany. There were Germanic states, which were forged into what we now call Germany, or they call it Deutschland. It was fairly stagnant intellectually and culturally. And like many parts of Europe, the people, the common folk, spoke one language, in this case German. The educated classes, generally used like Latin, which is, if you ever wondered like, why do doctors and lawyers use like Latin? Well, part because it sounds cooler than normal, non-Latin languages. but also because during the Roman Empire, Latin was a primary language, and it became sort of, became the language of the church, and the church was one of the few surviving sources of education and learning, and so it kind of stuck. I mean, originally Latin was just a normal language, it wasn't like fancy or anything, but then it gradually became kind of fancy. Maybe English will do the same thing. 1,000 years from now, the doctors and lawyers will be, space doctors and space lawyers using English terms for things, because English was cool then, because it's from the old empire. Now, Germany, of course, faced the trials and tribulations of the Protestant Reformation, which of course, broke up the Catholic Church. And of course, there's also the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. And one of the consequences of this war was the Treaty of Westphalia, which did a critical thing for Europe. One of the rulings in it was whoever had the region, it got his religion. So whoever, if the prince or duke or count was like Catholic, then that was a Catholic zone. If they were Protestant, there was a Protestant zone. Because the 30-Year War is primarily about religion, and they settled that in a way by creating the modern nation state. If you take political science and history, they'll typically point to the end of the 30 Years' War, 1648, as the birth of the modern nation state. Because, convenient point. Now, what we now call Germany didn't really produce any other significant thinkers, except for Leibniz. And Leibniz kind of had the misfortune of being overshadowed, despite being a great thinker, being overshadowed by the emergence of even greater thinkers. It's kind of like having your TV show or your YouTube video come out, and then someone comes out with something even more amazing. You're like, of course it is. And timing, of course, is everything. You want to be the best thing that's out at the time, and not overshadowed. Now, Leibniz was, pretty smart. He got through school very quickly, ended up going and becoming a lawyer, professional school at a very young age, and was given that opportunity to become a professor. But instead, he chose to become a diplomat. So even though we know him primarily as a philosopher, his real profession was diplomacy. And he did most of his philosophical writing kind of on the side, kind of as a hobby. But that's what he's best known for. Now his works include, probably the best known is the monadology, his metaphysics. He also wrote a work on the Theodicy, which is a look at the problem of evil, and a lot of essays, etc. Now he's also well known for his work in mathematics. And interestingly enough, they discovered that he had proven solved various mathematical problems that they didn't realize anybody had solved them. They were solved again fairly recently, and they're like, wow, I didn't solve this, this is already done. So when I heard about that, I kind of wondered like how many great things are just like in some book in somebody's attic that solves like, oh, look, cure for cancer, world peace, who knew? Someone figured that out, 50 years ago. Could have avoided all that crap. Oh look, a way to get away from Twitter. Actually, it's an easy way. Uninstall. Now, in addition to his diplomacy, he also developed a logical method for dealing with mathematics, etc. And the thing that probably his greatest contribution was this. In doing his math stuff, Leibniz figured out that you could take all of math, crudely speaking, and reduce it down to 0 and 1, and do all of the maths. And this, of course, was incredibly important because you end up with just two basic elements, 0 and 1, and you can do all the math. And he worked out, the logic of this, which, of course, fast forward to today, this, of course, is the foundation for all the information systems. If you're looking at Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or YouTube on your phone, it's all powered by zeros and ones and deductive logic, basically Leibniz's stuff. Now he believed, given his success in mathematics, reducing it all to zeros and ones, He believed you could do that with everything. You could take every field of study, reduce it down to the simples, the most basic things, work out the appropriate language, metaphorically speaking, the programming language, and you could solve all the problems. Just like in math, you can sit down and do equations and figure out all the stuff. He believed you could do the same thing with like law, with ethics, with metaphysics. And all you have to do is just have the right equations and the right simples, and you can solve all of the problems. Now, in a way, he was kind of right. How so? Well, the mathematics thing worked out pretty well, because it gave us, computers, all the stuff we have. And he was also right in many ways about other things as well. The problem we ran into, though, was a problem of basically computational power. Namely, what you need is, well, to model reality, you would need the appropriate formulas, the equations, and you need enough processing power to emulate reality. To give a concrete example, how do they predict weather today? I mean, aside from like guessing and going, my knee hurts, or my bad knee hurts, it's probably gonna rain. How do scientists like predict the weather?
Satellites.
Yeah, I mean, how do they, when they do the forecast, what are they doing? Are they just like guessing?
Yeah, like the weather pattern, and where it's going, where it's going.
Yeah, and what does all those calculations for them?
Compute.
Yeah, so they plug in, if you read a fair number of hurricanes here, so if you live in Florida, well, eventually you get an interest in hurricanes, or if you're not interested in them, they're still interested in us. And they'll have various models. And what they'll do is they'll have all these, basically a program that tries to model the behavior of a hurricane. And they'll put in all the data they get from the satellites and past things loaded in there. And what it's supposed to do is recreate in a computer model reality. And the idea would be, which is Leibniz's idea, if you had the perfect algorithms that mirrored reality, and you had perfect data, and you had enough computing power, you'd know exactly how a storm would work. And of course, this could in theory apply to anything. So if you wanted to predict, say, people's behavior in an election, they try to do that now. They pull in all the data, put it into algorithms and try to predict. If you had the perfect algorithms, perfect data, and enough computing power, you could know the result, in theory, of any election or anything. So Leibniz's model is still being applied today. The whole big data thing essentially is attempting to make his project real. The idea being you give the right algorithms, the right formulas, the right data, enough processing power, and you answer all the questions. Now, of course, this does lead to a question of metaphysics, namely, is reality utterly predictable? Because if there's like random chance, then no. All you could say is there's like kind of they do with models now, when they show the path of the hurricane, it's projected. It could go like anywhere in this zone. And one question is it that we just don't know, and it's and there's really no chance or randomness, or is it really random? In other words, is reality like dice-based, where things can just happen randomly, or is it all like scripted, all fixed? And then of course there's also the metaphysical question of free will. If you had algorithms for people, could it still get things wrong? Could it, not because of bad algorithms or bad data, but because people could just freely choose something else? And so one of the limiting factors on big data is metaphysics. Is the world deterministic or random, and do people have free will or not? And then of course Leibniz died. He's still dead today. Now, in addition to doing the math stuff and diplomacy stuff, in his dream he had two big dreams, or three big dreams. One was, of course, to develop a system a system of philosophy that would solve all problems, which didn't succeed in his time, but making progress. He also wanted to unify Europe, because Europe was torn asunder by war after war. So how did that work out? Is Europe unified? Well, more so than in his day. I mean, the last time we had a big European war was World War II. Although Russia, they're getting back into that. They've had a few small police actions or wars. Also, he wanted to reunify Christianity. Well, how'd that work out? Well, on one hand, no. On the other hand, when was the last time there was, war between sects of Christianity? Well, quite a while. So although there are like all these separate churches now, at least they're not, killing each other over religious doctrines. So, progress. Now, his other big deal was, of course, God. Trying to prove God, and he had a special interest in what is known as the problem of evil. But first, more proving God. Now, like other thinkers before him, he lays out, kind of the three standard arguments. He has his own ontological argument, God being perfect, God exists, blah, blah. Also has a design argument and a cosmological argument. He also, of course, has one involving eternal and necessary truths. But again, the general view, kind of generally accepted view, is any argument for God that's based in reason, you can kind of jam into one of those categories. It's ontological, cosmological, or the design. It's called teleological. So how does he prove God's existence? Well, he gives, essentially some repeats of previous arguments. We'll take a look at a couple of his to see what he added to them. First argument is this. He begins by talking about what God is, and he claims that God is the supreme substance. Now, in philosophy, substance is like stuff, and there are a couple of views of it. One, going back to Aristotle, a substance is a thing that can exist on its own. It can exist independently. What does that mean? Well, use my usual example of this plastic folder. Now, as we wander through life, we encounter things that have shapes and colors and size and densities and masses, but we would never encounter just like reddish. Not a reddish thing, just like reddish. We never encounter just like square floating by itself. We encounter square things, but not just like square. Likewise, we encounter things with mass, but not just like mass by itself. And like with this folder, I couldn't like have a magic, claw and pull away like red and have a handful of red. I mean, I could bleach it or something, and I can't like reach in with a magic claw and pull out like its shape and have like pure shape. So one thing that people back then wondered, so why is that? Why can you encounter things like folders and chairs and squirrels and possums and stuff, but you never encounter just like blue off by itself or square by itself? And so what people did is they went with Aristotle's idea that the substance is a thing that can exist by itself, and that's the most intuitive version is they'd be kind of like objects with all those qualities. So you can have like a folder, you can encounter those, but something like red or square or weighing 5 pounds, you don't find those by itself. You couldn't like have a box and inside the box have weighing 5 pounds. You could have something in the box that weighed 5 pounds, but you couldn't just have weighing 5 pounds, just hanging by itself, supposedly. And so they said, yeah, you got the substance. Now, what people later kind of evolved was how this kind of supposedly works. And here's the idea. One way to think of like substance in the sense is think of like a Mr. Potato Head toy, and think of the potato part as substance. And of course, with a Mr. Potato Head, you play with it by doing what? Yeah, sticking the parts like in first, weird places, weird, mutated, freaky potato creatures. And you can think of it metaphorically as the potatoes like the substance, and the parts you're putting in are the qualities. So it's like the subject, and the things you're putting in are the predicates, the qualities. So the idea is that a substance is a thing that can exist on its own. It's something that has properties. And we'll see more of this in the future when we talk about good dead friend, John Locke. Now for Leibniz, God is supposed to be a substance. And back in the day when Leibniz was Leibnizing, substance was all the rage. You know, people like Locke and Descartes, they all accepted substance. Some loved it, like Descartes, and some were like, I guess we got to accept it, like John Locke. Now he takes God to be the supreme substance, which I guess is substance with sour cream and guacamole on top of it. It's like a nacho supreme. Now, his definition of God essentially is, crudely put, God is perfect. So he's unique, universal, necessary. Nothing else is independent of God. He is utterly unlimited, and he's as real can be. Crudely put, he's not only perfect, but absolutely perfect. So all the positive qualities are from God, which kind of foreshadows the problem of evil. And anything that is defective, that's not God's fault. That's other stuff's fault. So how does this get us to God? Well, he kind of smushes together here some of the arguments, but the gist is this. If you get stuff, that comes from God. So it's kind of like a bit of the cosmological argument. Also, he puts in, some of the ontological argument about God being, if God is necessary, then he's got to exist. And he also kind of works in this idea, kind of intriguing or tricky idea, which is that, again, like Anselm argued, God's got to exist, and it only applies to God. And here's kind of how the reasoning, put kind of crudely, can go. Now, almost everyone agree that God is possible, that he could exist. So it's possible there could be a being that must exist. But if it's possible a being could exist that must exist, that means that there would be some world in which this being exists. So since it's possible for the being to exist, it's necessary. If it's necessary, that means it must exist. So it's possible for a necessary being to exist, it's got to exist. So his reasoning is the mere possibility of God existing proves that he does exist, which is pretty clever. So if anybody says, yeah, I guess God could exist, then Leibniz would say, well, then he must exist. And later thinkers ran with that even more. So next time, on the Wednesday, we'll pick up looking at the cosmological argument, then head towards evil.